DNS Zones. A DNS zone is a file on your DNS server that manages a portion of a domain namespace. When we consider a domain, for example, winstructorlab.com, the winstructorlab.com DNS server will be configured to hold the zone for winstructorlab.com. Now, if winstructorlab.com has a subdomain called london.winstructorlab.com, then this could also be managed by the winstructorlab.com zone. But if winstructorlab.com uses delegation, then there would be an additional zone created for the london.winstructorlab.com domain, and then an additional DNS server in the london.winstructorlab.com domain would be responsible for managing DNS in that subdomain, and any request for hosts in the London domain would be forwarded to the DNS server in the London domain. So let's go and take a look at how we can create our own zones, and to do that we'll need to use the DNS console. So we'll click on Start, we'll go to Administrative Tools, and we'll launch the DNS console. Now, before we actually go ahead and create a zone, I want to briefly talk about what forward and reverse lookup zones are. Now, when we convert a host name to an IP address, we're actually performing a forward lookup. The DNS server checks to see if it has a host or an A record for the name it needs to find. If it finds the record, it's going to send back the associated IP address back to the DNS client that requested it. A reverse lookup is exactly the opposite. It's a query where we know the IP address, but we don't know the host name. So our DNS server, if configured with a reverse lookup zone, will check the IP address against its records and return the host name. Alright, with that basic explanation out of the way, and we'll talk more about this later, if we select our forward lookup zones, or we select our reverse lookup zones, either way, in the right hand side you're going to notice that since this is a new DNS server, we don't have any forward or reverse lookup zones defined. Now, in my network here at the moment, I actually have 3 domain controllers and 3 domains, all of which are running Active Directory domain services and DNS already. This server that I'm on right now is another server that we installed in the last video, so we'll use this one as our method of discussing DNS since this server has no configuration done to it. But in your environment, you'll probably find that you'll be installing DNS on your domain controllers like I've done in my network here. So the first thing we're going to do here is to create a new forward lookup zone. So we're going to right click on forward lookup zones and we'll choose to create a new one. And this is going to start up the new zone wizard, so we'll click next. Now we've got 3 options here. We can create a primary zone, a secondary zone, and a stub zone. But if our DNS server was also a domain controller, we do also have the option of making this zone Active Directory integrated. Now, firstly, a primary zone is the first zone that's created on a traditional DNS server. Primary zones hold read and write copies of the zone, which means they can be updated by this DNS server. You'll be choosing a primary zone when this DNS server is going to be authoritative for a DNS domain. For example, if you've registered the domain training.com, you'll need to create a primary zone for the DNS domain training.com so that this DNS server can manage and update all of the hosts for that domain. A secondary zone is a copy of a primary zone which exists on a secondary DNS server. Secondary zones are read-only, which means they can't be directly updated. Instead, a primary zone will transfer a copy of their zone file to a secondary DNS server. We'll use secondary zones on DNS servers to help clients resolve DNS queries faster than they might if they had to contact the primary DNS server each time. For example, if we only have a single DNS domain spread over multiple sites, we could create a DNS server with a secondary zone and install it at a remote site so that our remote client could query that DNS server locally, and it being local, it's going to resolve names much faster. Now, a stub zone is a forward lookup zone to an external domain that you look up quite frequently. A stub zone contains entries for the name server of the external domain, the start of authority, and potentially some host records which are known as glue records. The advantage of using a stub zone is that your DNS servers don't have to go out to the root and the .com servers to locate the external DNS server. We'll pre-configure it with the external DNS server's IP address, and then we can forward queries for that domain directly to the right DNS server. Now, if you are installing DNS on a domain controller, and it's more than likely that you will be, then it's a good idea to make your DNS zones Active Directory integrated. That way, you'll get the security and replication benefits of Active Directory included with DNS. But if your server isn't a domain controller like mine isn't, then this option will be grayed out. So since I already have a primary zone on another server in my network, we'll go ahead and we'll create a secondary zone, as the process is practically identical anyway. So we'll select secondary zone and then we'll click next. Now we need to enter in the name of the zone, and this is going to be winstructorlab.com, and we'll click next again. Now since this is a secondary zone that we're creating, we'll need to tell the wizard where the master server is, or in other words, the server that holds the primary zone. So we'll enter in the IP address of our domain controller here, which is 10.32.0.2, and we'll hit enter. And if it can find it correctly, it should come back with the name of our server, which is DCO1, which it does. So we'll click next and then finish. And there we can see our new secondary zones being created. Now if we expand forward lookup zones and then select our zone here, winstructorlab.com, you'll notice that we have an error here telling us that our zone hasn't been loaded since the transfer from the master has failed. Now, if we right click on our secondary zone, you might be tempted to choose transfer from master or reload from master, and if we select any of these, you notice that we still have a problem. Now the reason that we have this error is nothing to do with the secondary zone that we've just created. It's just that by default, our primary zone isn't configured to allow zone transfers. So we'll right click on DNS and we'll connect to another DNS server. Now we'll choose to connect to the following computer, and I'm going to type in DCO1 and click on OK. Now we'll expand out DCO1 and then we'll expand forward lookup zones. And we'll select our forward lookup zone here, winstructorlab.com, and we'll right click on it and choose properties. Now we'll select the zone transfers tab, and you'll notice that we aren't allowing zone transfers by default, which of course is why our secondary server isn't able to load that zone. So we'll check this box to allow zone transfers, but notice that here the default is to allow zone transfers to any server. Well, we certainly don't want to do that, since that could be a security concern. So we'll either select the second or the third option here to allow zone transfers to only servers listed on the name servers tab, or only ones listed here in this window. So let's just add it in here. So we'll choose the third option and we'll click on the edit button. And then we'll need to enter in the IP address of DCO2, which is 10.32.0.3. And then we'll click on OK. And then we'll click on the notify button. And the default is to automatically notify the following servers when the primary zone is updated. So again, I'm going to enter in 10.32.0.3. And then we'll click on OK. Alright, now we'll click on OK again. And if we go back to our secondary zone that we created on DCO2 and refresh it, we should be able to see that it will then work fine, and all of the information in that zone should be copied across to this server. Alright, now since my primary zone held on DCO1 was automatically created when we installed Active Directory, in fact nothing else has changed, this is the default as it was when we installed Active Directory, so let's now work with that DNS server from now on, since like I mentioned earlier, in most cases you will be running Active Directory integrated zones. So let's right click on our forward lookup zones again and we'll select New Zone and we'll click Next, and this time we'll take a look at creating a stub zone. Since this is a domain controller, we can also choose to store this zone in Active Directory, which we will do, since it enables DNS information to be replicated along with Active Directory information. So we're going to leave this box checked and we'll click Next. Now we can choose how we want this data to be replicated. To all DNS servers in this forest, to all DNS servers in our winstructorlab.com domain, or to all domain controllers in the domain. Now I'm going to leave the default here at all DNS servers inside our winstructorlab.com domain, and we'll click Next. Alright, well here we'll need to enter in the zone name. Now I have another child domain here in my network called New York, and we could create a stub zone that points to that domain, and this would be useful when we have a situation where those guys in the New York domain manage their own DNS servers and they don't want us to transfer a copy of their zone. So primary and secondary zones are out, but we still could create a stub zone, which allows our DNS server to have a pointer to their DNS server, so it makes contacting that server faster. So we'll use the zone name of newyork.winstructorlab.com, and we'll click next. And then we'll need to enter in the IP address of the DNS server in the New York domain, which is 10.32.0.200. And we'll click next, and then finish. And that's it. People from our domain that need to resolve the names of hosts in the New York domain will contact this DNS server, and this DNS server knows exactly where to find the DNS server for New York. Now this also works for external domains as well. In fact, it's most likely to be used for external domains. Let's say that you have another company that you do a lot of business with, or perhaps even a website that you use frequently, like winstructor.com, of course. So let's right-click on our forward lookup zones again, and we'll choose a new zone. We'll click next, and we'll create a stub zone again, and we'll click next. Now I'm going to leave the default here to replicate it to all of our DNS servers in our domain. We'll click next. Now we'll go and click on Start, and we'll open up a command prompt, and we'll type in DNS Lookup and hit Enter. And now we'll type in set type equals NS, and we'll hit Enter again, and then we'll enter in the domain of winstructor.com and hit Enter. And you'll notice that this has returned the IP addresses of the DNS servers for winstructor.com. So what we'll do is we'll right click and we'll choose Mark, and we'll highlight one of these addresses and then hit Enter, and that'll copy that IP address to the Windows clipboard. And now if we go back to our DNS console, we'll enter in winstructor.com and we'll choose Next. Although there's actually something I should point out here. If your target for this stub zone, in our case winstructor.com, doesn't allow TCP traffic through port 53 on their firewall, then this won't work. So you should know by now that client queries are sent over UDP port 53, but secondary DNS servers perform zone transfers over TCP port 53, as do stub zones for pulling start of authority, name server, and glue records. Now, a lot of administrators don't like to leave TCP port 53 open, so do bear that in mind if you run into some problems. Anyway, we'll now paste in the IP address that we just copied from the command prompt a minute ago, and we'll click Next, and then Next again, and then Finish. Now, if we double click on our winstructor.com zone, we'll be able to see here all of the name servers for winstructor.com created on a stub zone in our network. Now that means, like with our New York zone, we'll now be able to resolve hosts on the winstructor.com domain quicker since we know where the DNS servers are. Now we've talked about primary zones, secondary zones and stub zones, so let's move on and we'll take a quick look at reverse lookup zones as well. Now if you recall, a reverse lookup zone allows us to associate an IP address with a host name. And if we select reverse lookup zones, you'll notice that we don't have one created by default, so let's right click on it and choose to create a new zone. Now that brings up our new zone wizard again, so we'll click Next. And like when we created our forward zone, we've got the same three options. We could create a primary, secondary, or stub zone, so we'll choose a primary zone this time and store this in Active Directory, and we'll click Next. We'll leave the default to replicate the DNS data to all DNS servers in our winstructorlab.com domain. We'll click Next again. Now we can either create an IPv4 or IPv6 reverse lookup zone, so I'm going to leave the default here at IPv4 and click Next. And now we'll need to enter in the first three octets of our network. Now we're using 10.32.0 IP scheme, so let's enter that in and we'll click Next. Although actually I'll just go back here for the moment, because down the bottom here you'll notice in this field we've got this 0.32.10.in.address.arpa. That's been populated automatically. Now you could select either of these two boxes and fill in whichever one you prefer. Technically, the reverse lookup zone requires this second formatting. Microsoft has just made it easier for you by automatically populating this box when you fill in the first section. So you can fill in whichever one you prefer. Just remember, it needs to follow the format of your network ID as you'd normally write it if you use the section at the top, or your network ID in reverse, followed by this in.address.arpa. You see, forward lookup zones work from general to specific, whereas reverse lookup zones work from specific to General. So with that explanation out of the way, we'll click Next again, and we can choose whether we want to allow dynamic updates. Now the default here is to only allow secure dynamic updates, which means that clients that are part of our domain are able to update DNS. And what this does, by the way, is allow your regular clients and your devices in your domain to dynamically update DNS with their IP addresses, but only if they are a member of the domain. However, you can choose to allow both non-secure and secure updates, or not to allow dynamic updates at all, but we're going to leave the default here as it's more secure, and we'll click Next and then Finish. Now the final thing I want to point out about zones is delegating zones. Now if we expand our winstructorlab.com forward lookup zone, you'll notice that we do have a couple of grey folders down the bottom here for London and New York. This grey coloured folder gives us a visual cue that these are delegated DNS domains. So when requests come into our network that request a host from either of these subdomains, they're going to hit our DNS server, which will see that London and New York subdomains have been delegated, and it will forward the request onto the name server that's listed in the name server record. The only negative thing with delegation is that if the administrator managing either of these two domains adds a new DNS server, then we won't know anything about it. In contrast, had we have created a stub zone for this domain back on our primary, we'd see any changes that were made to that zone. Now if you want to add in your own delegation, we can easily do that, but first we'll need to add a new primary zone that we can delegate to. So let's use our other server here, DCO2, so let's right click on forward lookup zones and we'll create a new one. We'll click Next and we'll create a primary zone, and we'll click Next again. Now let's call this zone test.winstructorlab.com. And we'll click Next. Now, since this server isn't a domain controller, we'll need to create a zone file, and I'll accept the default, although had we have already created a zone file on another server, we could use the second option here and import it from that server if we like. So we'll leave the default, create a new one, we'll click Next. We'll choose not to allow dynamic updates, we'll click Next again, and then Finish. Now up on our server here, DCO1, we'll right click on forward lookup zones, we'll right click on our forward lookup zone for winstructorlab.com and we'll choose a new delegation. Then we'll click Next, and then we'll enter in the name of the domain that we'll be delegating queries to. So we'll enter in test, and this will populate the fully qualified domain name of test.winstructorlab.com for us. So we'll click Next, and then we'll need to enter in the IP address or the host name of the server that we'll be delegating control to. So we'll click on Add, and then at the top we'll enter in DCO2, and we'll click Resolve, and then OK, and then we'll click Next, and then Finish. Now there's our new test delegation. Again, it's a grey folder here, so you can instantly recognise it as a delegation that points to our server DCO2. So now if someone on our winstructorlab.com network needs to contact a host from the test domain, which is a fictional domain of course, this server will instantly know where that DNS query needs to go. In this video we've talked about DNS zones. At the very least, when you create your own network, you're going to need at least one primary zone, which will most likely be an Active Directory integrated zone. However, you can also create secondary zones on other servers where you don't want primary zones, so you can pull a read-only copy of the primary zone. And don't forget, if you've seen our video on read-only domain controllers, you can also use a read-only domain controller to provide read-only zones as well. So if you haven't watched that video, I'd encourage you to go and check it out. Finally, we talked about stub zones and how they're useful to point to DNS servers where you don't have any control over them, but you need to resolve hosts on that network frequently. We hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for supporting Winstructor.